At 64, Marion Oakes owned three things that mattered: a casserole dish she had carried into too many hospital rooms to count, a pair of reading glasses held together at the hinge with electrical tape, and a key small plain brass lighter than it had any right to be to a house on Harrow Mill Road that nobody wanted. Nobody except the people who kept telling her it was worthless. That was the part she couldn't stop thinking about on the drive out of Franklin County, with the key sitting in the cup holder and Gerald's voice still somewhere in the back of her mind. Everything I couldn't say out loud I put in the ground. She hadn't understood what he meant when he said it. She'd thought it was the medication talking, or the kind of thing a man says when he knows he's running out of time and wants to sound like he isn't. But Gerald Oakes had never once said anything he didn't mean. And the family that spent 30 years treating Marion like a guest in her own marriage, the ones who laughed at the leaning porch and the patched tin roof, and called the whole property a burden she didn't need. They had stopped laughing by the time it was over. Not because the house changed, because they finally saw what was behind it. And what was behind it had been waiting the whole time. At 64, Marion Oakes had learned that grief did not always arrive the way people expected it to. It did not always come in the form of tears at a graveside, or the hollow quiet of a bedroom that still smelled like someone who was no longer there. Sometimes grief came in the form of a room full of people who had never truly seen you, all watching to see what you would do next. The conference room on the second floor of Denton and Associates smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee that no one had touched. 4 chairs sat on one side of the long table. Marion sat on the other alone, the way she had sat through most things in the 31 years she had been connected to the Oakes and Hale family's present patient, and slightly to the side of whatever was actually being decided. Conrad Hale sat directly across from her. He was 68 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now was merely certain of itself. He wore a dark jacket and a watch that caught the light whenever he moved his wrist, which was often. Conrad was a man who had always understood that small movements could communicate large things. The watch said he had places to be. The jacket said those places mattered. The particular way he arranged his hands on the table said that this meeting was already, in his estimation, a formality. Sylvia Hale sat to his left. She was 65, carefully dressed in a cream-colored coat that had not come from anywhere local. Her hair was the kind of silver that required maintenance to look effortless, and she wore it with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades making effort invisible. She had offered Marion a small smile when they entered the room. It was the kind of smile that could mean almost anything and therefore meant nothing. Lawson Hale sat at the end of the row, away from his parents by 2 chairs and approximately 30 years of accumulated disappointment. He was 38, lean in the way of someone who had once been athletic and now was merely restless. He had not looked at his phone since sitting down, which Marion noticed because it was unusual. Lawson was the kind of young man who used his phone the way other people used eye contact, to avoid being fully present in rooms that made him uncomfortable. He looked uncomfortable now, and he was not looking at his phone. Mr. Denton entered last and sat at the head of the table. He was somewhere in his early 60s, thin, with reading glasses he wore on a lanyard around his neck rather than on his face. He carried a folder that he placed on the table and did not immediately open. He greeted everyone by name. His voice was the kind of voice that had been trained over many years of practice to carry information without carrying opinion. Marion folded her hands in her lap. She had dressed simply that morning. A dark blue cardigan over a gray blouse. Shoes she could walk in. She had not dressed to impress anyone in this room, and she was aware that this itself was a kind of statement, though she had not intended it as one. She had dressed the way she had always dressed for difficult days, practically and without apology. Mr. Denton opened the folder. He read clearly and without rushing. The language of wills and legal instruments had a particular rhythm to it, declarative, repetitive, sealed against ambiguity. Marian listened. The house at 417 Harrow Mill Road. The parcel of land registered in Gerald Oakes's name since 1987. All structures, improvements, water features, and recorded rights belonging to or associated with the property. All of it in full to Marian Louise Oakes' widow. Conrad made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. The quiet, controlled exhale of a man who had expected something different and was recalibrating. Sylvia placed one hand on the table, palm down, as though steadying herself against a surface that had shifted slightly. Lawson looked out the window. Marian looked at the folder. Then Mr. Denton paused in a way that was not incidental. He turned to the next page and adjusted his reading glasses on his nose. He said that there was an additional provision that Gerald Oakes had specifically requested be read in full in the presence of all named parties. Conrad straightened slightly. Gerald Oakes, Mr. Denton continued, had executed a formal revocation of all co-signing authority previously extended to Conrad William Hale in any matter pertaining to the Harrow Mill Road property or any associated land rights. This revocation had been notarized and filed with the county recorder's office 16 months prior to Gerald's death. As of that date, Conrad Hale had held no legal authority to act on behalf of, negotiate for, or enter into agreements concerning any aspect of the Harrow Mill Road property. The room was very quiet. Conrad's hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, did not move. His face did not change. That was the thing Marian would remember most clearly when she replayed this moment later. Not a flinch, not a flicker, not the smallest adjustment in the muscles around his eyes. Just stillness. The practiced, pre-existing stillness of a man who had already known what was coming and had prepared his face in advance. That stillness told her everything. Sylvia looked at Conrad. Conrad did not look back at her. Lawson turned from the window. Mr. Denton finished reading. He asked if there were any questions. There were no questions. He said that copies of all documents would be provided to each party, and that his office was available for any follow-up matters requiring legal clarification. He said this the way lawyers said things they did not expect to result in follow-up carefully, correctly, and without warmth. Conrad stood before anyone else. He buttoned the middle button of his jacket, which was the kind of small, composed gesture that men of a certain type performed when they needed a moment to arrange their next move without appearing to need it. He said something to Sylvia in a low voice. She nodded and reached for her coat. He looked at Marian once before he left the room. Not long, not with any expression she could name. Just the look of a man making a note of something. Then he was gone. Sylvia followed. Lawson lingered a moment at the door, almost looked back, and then did not. Marian remained seated. Mr. Denton was gathering his papers. He paused without being asked. He said in a quieter register than he had used during the reading that Gerald had been very specific about the ordering of that provision. He had requested it be read last after the main bequest and in the presence of all parties. He had been, Mr. Denton said, a man who thought carefully about the difference between information and revelation. Marian looked at the folder still open on the table. She asked if there was anything else she needed to know today. Mr. Denton considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then he said that there was one more item. He reached into the folder and produced a small envelope. It was not legal stationery. It was an ordinary envelope, the kind that came in a box of 20 from a drugstore gone soft at the corners from being handled. Her name was written on the front in Gerald's handwriting, blocky, deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had never fully trusted cursive. Beneath her name, a single line. The way Gerald had always communicated the things that mattered most plainly, without decoration. Don't open this until you're at the house. Marian took the envelope. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she placed it in her purse, thanked Mr. Denton, and walked out of the room. In the lobby below, she could hear Conrad's voice, controlled, modulated, directing something at someone already moving on to whatever came next. She did not go toward the sound. She went through the side door to the parking lot where the October air hit her face with the particular sharpness of a Tennessee autumn that has decided to mean it. She sat in her car for a while without starting the engine. The envelope was in her purse. The key would be at the house, she assumed, or perhaps in the envelope itself. She did not know yet. She only knew that Gerald had left her something, and that Conrad had known about the revocation before anyone else in that room, and that his face had given away only one thing. He had known, and he had come anyway. That told her the land was worth more than anyone had said. Gerald Oakes had not been a sentimental man. He had not marked anniversaries with cards or expressed appreciation through gestures that required planning. He had shown up. That was the thing about Gerald that most people who had not spent real time with him failed to understand. He showed up. He was there when things needed to be done, and he did them. And he did not require acknowledgement, and he did not offer it easily either. It was a quality that made him difficult and also in certain lights. One of the most reliable people Marian had ever known. She thought about this on the drive out of town. The road from the county seat to Harrow Mill Road was 40 minutes of the kind of Tennessee landscape that looked modest until you paid attention to it. Rolling fields going gold and rust with the seasoned tree lines broken by old fence posts. The occasional barn that had outlasted whoever built it by several decades. The road itself narrowed as she drove. Houses sat farther back from the shoulder. Mailboxes appeared less frequently. By the time the turnoff appeared, the world had quieted to a register she hadn't heard in some time. The property at 417 Harrow Mill Road sat at the end of a gravel drive that needed resurfacing. The gate was old iron, hinged but functional, and it swung inward when she pushed it with both hands. The house beyond was smaller than she remembered from her last visit, which had been 2 winters ago, when she had brought Gerald a casserole and sat with him at the kitchen table while he ate and said very little and seemed in his particular way grateful for the company. The porch dipped at one corner where the support beam had settled. The tin roof had been patched in 2 places with a slightly different grade of metal that caught the light differently from the rest. The siding had gone the color of old, left in weather, not quite gray, not quite brown, somewhere between giving up and deciding to stay. Marian stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at it. Conrad had made a sound in that conference room. Sylvia had called it at the reception after the funeral a situation. She had not used that word in a complimentary way. Various cousins and in-laws at various points over the past 3 decades had made assessments of this property that ranged from dismissive to actively discouraging. The house had been in the vocabulary of the Hale family, a project, a problem, a peculiarity, and most recently a liability. What it looked like to Marian standing at the bottom of those steps in the October light was a place where a man had lived honestly. She went inside. The interior smelled of dust in closed rooms and the particular mustiness of a house that had not been properly heated in months. The furniture was old and mismatched in the way of things accumulated over a long life rather than selected. The kitchen was at the back, and Marian went there first, the way she always had when she visited Gerald, straight to the kitchen where the practical things were, where a person could be useful without having to explain themselves. The chipped blue mug was still beside the sink. She had given it to him years ago, picked up at a church sale because he had complained that his coffee always tasted like metal, and she had thought at the time that the mug was probably not the issue, but had not said so. She opened the hock drawer beneath the counter. The envelope was there. Not the one Mr. Denton had given her, a second envelope identical in type with her name on the front, in the same blocky handwriting. Beside it, a small key, old, narrow, darker than the color of new brass, with a short tag of masking tape wrapped around the bow. Written on the tape in blue pen in Gerald's hand, GPS Coord's jacket pocket. Marian reached into the inside pocket of the light jacket she'd thrown over her cardigan that morning. She found a folded piece of paper she had not known was there. She opened it. A set of coordinates, written in pencil. Below them, Gerald had added, "Don't open the shed until you understand why I left it to you and not to them." She read it twice. She stood in the kitchen of a house everyone called worthless and held a key and a set of coordinates and a question she did not yet know how to answer, and she understood for the first time the shape of what Gerald had done. He had not left her a house. He had left her a sequence, a series of steps he had arranged in advance in the correct order, for reasons he had not fully explained, trusting her to follow them without being rushed. She sat down at the kitchen table. The afternoon light came through the window at a low October angle and lay across the linoleum in a pale band. Marian placed the key on the table. She placed the coordinates beside it. She put her hands flat on the table surface, which was slightly sticky in the way of surfaces that had been wiped many times with a damp cloth and never quite gotten clean. She thought about the question Gerald had written, why I left it to you and not to them. She had carried things into this house for years. Groceries when the weather was bad and Gerald's truck needed a new alternator he kept putting off replacing. Medicine when his prescription ran out and he wouldn't drive to town. Soup in the winter twice when he had something respiratory and sat in his chair with a blanket and refused to acknowledge he needed it but ate the soup without being asked twice. She had driven him to appointments in Murfreesboro that he had not told anyone else about because he didn't want to hear opinions about what the doctors said. She had sat in waiting rooms reading old magazines while he talked to physicians in private and driven him home in silence and not asked questions he hadn't offered to answer. She had never thought of any of this as particular. She had thought of it as the thing you did for someone who needed it done. But Gerald had apparently thought of it differently. The phone rang in her purse. She looked at the screen. Conrad. Not Sylvia, Conrad himself, she answered. His voice was warm. That was the first thing, the warmth which she had not expected after the conference room, and which told her immediately that he had decided on a particular strategy. He asked how she was doing. He said he understood this was a lot to absorb. He said he had been thinking about her on the drive home, and that he and Sylvia both wanted her to know that family was still family regardless of how legal documents read. She said she appreciated that. He said he'd like to come by the property at some point, help her get a sense of what she was dealing with, because there were things about old land that weren't obvious unless you knew the history. He said this casually, in the middle of other words, the way people place the thing they actually mean between the things they're willing to say. She said she'd let him know. He said he was in the area already as it happened and could stop by that afternoon if that was easier. Marian looked through the kitchen window at the back of the property, the shed sitting low in the distance, half hidden by brush, the tree line beyond it, dark and dense with the end of the season. She said she was still getting her bearings and it wasn't a good time. He said, of course, no rush. And then, as though it had just occurred to him, he asked about the old right-of-way at the back of the property, the access road that used to run through before the county changed the easements. He said he only asked because it could affect the property value if she was thinking about her options, and he wanted her to have the full picture. He had not asked about the house. He had not asked about the roof or the porch or whether the furnace was working or any of the things a person mentioned if they were thinking about a building. He had asked about the road. Marian said she hadn't looked at the back of the property yet. He said no rush, just something to keep in mind. She said goodbye and ended the call and sat very still at the kitchen table. She picked up her pen and her small notebook, the one she carried in her purse for grocery lists and appointment reminders and the occasional things she needed to remember precisely. She wrote, "Conrad called, asked about the road. Not the house, only the road." Then she underlined the last 3 words. Velma Brandt knocked on the front door at 4:30. She was 72 years old with iron gray hair pinned at the back of her neck, a green canvas coat that had seen better decades, and the particular directness in the eyes of a woman who had lived long enough to stop managing other people's comfort. She was carrying a dish of cornbread wrapped in a kitchen towel, and she offered it the way country women of a certain generation offered food, not as a pleasantry, but as a declaration of intent to be useful. She said her name. She said she'd been Gerald's neighbor for 23 years. She said she recognized Marian from the time Marian had come out to help Gerald move a piece of furniture that was too heavy for one man. Marian remembered. That had been 7 years ago at least. She let Velma in. They sat at the kitchen table. Velma set the cornbread between them and looked around the kitchen with the careful, cataloging look of someone who had been in this room many times and was noting what had changed and what had not. She didn't say anything about the house. She said Gerald had asked her to hold something for him. Marian went still. Velma reached into the inside pocket of her canvas coat and produced an envelope. It was sealed plain white with Marian's full name on the front. Velma held it without immediately handing it over. She said Gerald had come to her 8 months before he passed and asked her to keep it somewhere Conrad Hale would never think to look for it, which was anywhere at Velma Brandt's house, because Conrad Hale had never once in 23 years spoken directly to her. He had been, Velma said, with a particular flatness, a man who only spoke to people he thought were useful. She said Gerald's instruction had been specific. She was to give the envelope to Marian, and only to Marian, and only if Conrad Hale set foot on the Harrow Mill Road property within 30 days of Gerald's death. Marian asked when Conrad had come. Velma said the 9th day. She'd been on her front porch and watched his truck turn in the drive. He hadn't stayed long, maybe 20 minutes. He had walked around the outside of the house and the shed and stood at the back fence looking at the tree line before he left. He had not knocked on any doors. He had not told anyone he was coming. Velma set the envelope on the table. Marian picked it up. The flap was sealed with the kind of care that suggested Gerald had pressed it down more than once to make sure it held. She opened it at the seam and removed what was inside. It was a single document, 3 pages stapled. The top of the first page bore the seal of a notary public in Franklin County, and the date, 16 months before Gerald had died. The language was formal but unambiguous. Gerald Robert Oakes of sound, mind, and full legal capacity hereby revoked all co-signing authority previously extended to Conrad William Hale in any matter pertaining to the property at 417 Harrow Mill Road, including but not limited to rights of access, negotiation, sale, lease, or encumbrance. Any agreement or contract executed by Conrad William Hale purporting to represent the interests of Gerald Robert Oakes or the estate of Gerald Robert Oakes in relation to this property after the date of this revocation was to be considered legally void under the statutes of the state of Tennessee. The notary's stamp was clear. The signature was Gerald's. Marian read it twice. Then she read a handwritten note clipped to the back of the document, 4 lines in Gerald's handwriting, unsigned. He came 3 times before I did this. The 4th time he brought papers and told me I had already agreed. I had not. I called Denton the next morning. Velma was watching her read. Marian set the pages on the table and looked at them for a moment without speaking. She asked Velma how much she knew. Velma said Gerald had not told her what was in the envelope. He had told her only that it was important and that it needed to reach the right person at the right time. She said she had guessed it because she had lived next to that property for 23 years and had watched certain things from her front porch that she suspected not everyone had been meant to see. Marian asked what kind of things. Velma said there had been men with equipment in the backfield maybe 6 months ago. Not county workers, not farmers. Men with instruments she didn't know the name of, but recognized as the kind used when someone was looking at land seriously. She had watched from her porch across the fence line and noted the truck markings, which she hadn't been able to read from that distance, but had been bright orange on white. They had spent most of a day out there and left before dark. Gerald, she said, had still been alive at that point, just barely. Marian wrote down what Velma told her. She wrote carefully the same way she had written down what Conrad said on the phone, with the same instinct she couldn't fully name, but trusted the sense that precision now would matter later. Velma stayed another 20 minutes, had a piece of her own cornbread, and spoke about Gerald with the simple directness of someone describing a person they had understood. She said he was not easy. She said he was fair. She said he had once fixed her back gate in the middle of winter without being asked and left before she could thank him, and that this was the truest thing she knew about him. After she left, Marian sat alone at the kitchen table. The October light had gone. The kitchen was gray now, not quite dark, the kind of dim that made everything look like a photograph of itself. She spread the documents on the table in front of her. The notarized revocation, Gerald's handwritten note, the coordinates and the key, the envelope from the hawk drawer, the small notebook page where she had written what Conrad said on the phone. She looked at all of it together. Gerald had known. He had known what Conrad was doing while Gerald was still alive, still in this house, still capable of sitting at this table. He had known, and he had moved carefully. He had called a lawyer. He had filed documents. He had placed evidence with a neighbor who Conrad Hale would never think to consider. He had written coordinates on a piece of paper and tucked them into the pocket of a jacket he knew Marian would wear. He had prepared all of this, and then he had waited, and then he had died, trusting that she would find it in the right order. Don't open the shed until you understand why I left it to you and not to them. She understood now, not everything, but enough. They had treated her like a guest in a family that was not hers. They had tolerated her presence the way people tolerated furniture present, functional, unremarkable. Conrad had maneuvered around her for 3 decades, the way water moves around a fixed object, not because she was an obstacle, but because she was simply not considered a factor. Gerald had considered her, and he had trusted her with the thing Conrad wanted most, not because she had asked for it, not because she had ever indicated she expected anything, but because she had shown up, year after year, in all the ordinary and unwitnessed ways that did not appear in anyone's accounting of what mattered. She picked up her pen. Below what she had already written in the small notebook, she added one more line, not for evidence, not to remember, just because she needed to see it written in her own handwriting clearly in the gray October light of Gerald Oak's kitchen. He planned this. He trusted me. I am not going to move fast. Then she closed the notebook, pressed her hands flat on the table for a moment, and stood up. Outside, the wind had picked up across the backfield. She could hear it from where she stood, a low traveling sound moving through the trees beyond the fence. Somewhere out there past the shed she had not yet opened was something Conrad had already sent men to look at. Something he had signed his name to without permission. Something that had mattered enough for Gerald to spend his last remaining energy preparing a defense. The shed could wait one more night. She needed to see it in daylight, and she needed to think clearly first. She turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark. Tomorrow, she decided she would walk the land herself before anyone else arrived. before Earl Sutton and his measuring wheel, before Mr. Denton and his careful language, before any of the people who would want to help her by explaining what she was seeing. She would see it first on her own terms, the way Gerald had trusted she would. Then she went to check the locks on the doors, both of them, front and back. She checked them twice. She was up before the light. Not because she had slept well. She hadn't. The old house made sounds she had forgotten about, the particular vocabulary of a structure settling into cold air, the refrigerator, cycling on and off the wind, finding the gaps around the kitchen window frame that Gerald had probably meant to caulk and never gotten to. She had lain in the narrow guest bed with her eyes open for long portions of the night, listening to the house talk to itself. And somewhere around 3 a.m, she had stopped trying to sleep and started thinking instead. By 5:30 she was dressed. By 6 she had her jacket on, her notebook in her pocket, and the coordinates Gerald had written folded in her hand. She did not wait for Earl Sutton. She did not call Mr. Denton. She did not make coffee or eat breakfast or do any of the ordinary things that create a delay between a decision and the moment you act on it. She went out through the kitchen door and into the dark. The air was sharp in the way of Tennessee mornings in late October, carrying the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere distant, and the particular mineral cold that came up from the ground when it had held rain for several days. The sky was still more black than blue. She could see the shape of the shed against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, and beyond it the tree line, and beyond that, nothing she could yet name. She turned on the small flashlight she had found in Gerald's junk drawer. She followed the coordinates. The path Gerald's numbers led her on was not a path in any obvious sense. It was more the absence of certain obstacles, a gap in the old fence where someone had once removed 2 rails and never replaced them, a break in the brush line that looked accidental but repeated itself at intervals, suggesting intention, a shallow ditch that bent slightly at one point, as though it had been redirected long ago by someone who wanted water to go somewhere specific. Marian moved through all of it slowly, keeping the flashlight low, watching the ground more than the distance. Past the shed the land sloped. Not dramatically, this wasn't hill country exactly, just the long rolling grade of land that had once been farmed and had been let go long enough to begin its return to something older than cultivation. Dead grass flattened under her shoes. Blackberry canes caught at the hem of her coat. Then she found the first one. She almost missed it. The flashlight swept across the ground, and she had already taken another step when something registered, and she stopped and took a step back and crouched down in the wet grass. A hole. Not large, perhaps 4 inches in diameter, cylindrical, clean-sided. Filled at the top with loose soil that had been pushed back into it but hadn't settled with the weight and compression of natural ground. She pressed 2 fingers into the filled dirt. It was soft all the way down. She stood and moved the flashlight in a slow arc. There were more. She counted 5 within 30 feet of the first, each with the same characteristics. Clean bore loose. Fill the precise diameter of commercial core sampling equipment rather than anything agricultural or amateur. They formed a loose line running roughly parallel to the old fence, moving in the direction of the tree line. She stood in the middle of them and understood with the cold certainty of a woman who had spent 40 years managing a household and understood exactly what it meant when someone left evidence of themselves in a place they had no right to be, that these holes were recent. The filled dirt hadn't consolidated. The grass pressed flat around each site hadn't begun to recover. This had been done in the last few months. Done while Gerald was alive. Done while Gerald was alive and in a bed in a care facility 15 miles away, unable to come out here and see what was being done to his land. The sky had begun to lighten at the edges. Blue coming up behind the trees to the east, thin and pale as something just beginning to exist. Marian took out her notebook and wrote down what she had found: 5 boreholes. Location relative to the shed, approximate diameter, soil condition, the direction they ran. She used the flashlight to check if there were marks of passage in the area, and there were. A depression in the mud near the fence line that could have been anything but was shaped like the tread of a work boot. A place where brush had been pushed aside and had not fully returned to its previous position. She wrote it all down. Then she stood face to the tree line and walked toward it. The coordinates led her to a spot approximately 40 yards inside the edge of the woods where the trees thinned briefly around a lower piece of ground. The earth here was different, darker, denser, with the faint green of moss on the north sides of stones and the soft, spongy give of ground that held water close to the surface. Her flashlight picked up the movement before she heard it clearly, a thin silver thread of water slipping between 2 rocks and disappearing into the soil, only to surface again 3 feet farther down and continue south. A spring. Small, quiet, doing what springs did without announcement or ceremony, moving clean water from underground to the surface and then downhill, steady and continuous and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was watching. The fern beds around the rocks were still green despite the season. The soil at the margins was dark and rich. Marian crouched at the edge of it and held the flashlight close. The water was clear. She could see the stone bottom of the small pool where it surfaced pale granite smoothed by water over a very long time. She sat back on her heels and thought about Conrad asking her on the phone about the road at the back of the property, not the spring. He hadn't mentioned the spring. She wondered if he knew it was here. She suspected he did. She suspected his men with their core sampling equipment had known exactly where they were going and what they were looking for, and that the spring was connected to the road, and the road was connected to something larger than either of them, and that Gerald had understood this connection when he had decided not to sell. She stayed at the spring long enough for the light to finish arriving. Then she walked back to the house and picked up her phone. Earl Sutton drove a white truck that had been white for so long it had become a different color on the lower quarter panels. A road dust beige that no amount of washing would restore to its original state. He arrived at 9:30, which was when he had said he would arrive, and he came alone, which Marian had asked him to do. Velma had given her his name the evening before, calling him the most reliable pair of eyes in Franklin County for questions about old land, and adding that he charged fairly and did not waste time explaining what he already knew. I was 70 years old, lean brown, from decades outside, with a cap pulled low over a face that had the specific weathering of someone who had spent most of their professional life looking at the ground. He limped slightly on his right side, which he did not mention, and he carried a clipboard and a measuring wheel and a tube of rolled maps as though they were extensions of his own body rather than tools he had picked up before leaving the house. Marian showed him the boreholes first. He crouched at the nearest one without being told to, pressed the same 2 fingers into the fill dirt, the way she had done that morning, and said nothing for a moment. Then he stood, looked at the line of holes, looked toward the tree line, and made a sound that was not a word, but communicated that he was now taking things seriously, in a way he had not been quite certain he needed to when he pulled up the drive. He asked if she'd touched anything. She said no. He said good. He walked the line of boreholes, slowly making notes on his clipboard without explanation. At the last one nearest the fence, he stopped and studied the ground on the other side of the fence with the careful attention of a man reading something in a language he had spent 50 years learning. He pointed out 2 things she had missed in her own survey that morning: a worn place on the top rail of the fence where something had been regularly set or rested, and a gap in the soil crust on the far side that suggested the fence had been crossed multiple times at that specific point rather than by accident. Someone had been using this crossing regularly, not once, repeatedly. Earl said that the bore pattern was consistent with geotechnical investigation, the kind conducted before Marian asked what kind of something. He said he couldn't be certain yet. He said to show him the rest. She showed him the spring. He stood at its edge for longer than he had stood anywhere else. He looked at the fern beds, the moss lines, the direction of the water's movement. He took a folded copy of a USGS topographic map from inside his clipboard and oriented it against the landscape, turning it until the ridge lines matched. He traced a line with his finger. He said the spring was a surface expression of an underground aquifer that showed up on old county records as the Harrow Branch. He said it had been on the original land survey when this parcel was first mapped in the 1940s. He said it was the kind of water source that, combined with road access and commercial-grade timber, made a piece of land worth considerably more than its assessed value suggested. Marian looked at the water moving over the stones. She asked what the combination of all three things, the road, the spring, the timber, would mean for someone trying to develop the land to the north. Earl was quiet for a moment. He capped his pen. He said that the parcel north of the Harrow Mill Road property had changed ownership a few years ago and was now held by a company called Pinnacle Group, which was a commercial land development and infrastructure firm based in Nashville. He said he had done some survey work in the county during the same period and was aware that Pinnacle had been looking at that northern tract for a significant project, the details of which he did not have, but the scale of which he could estimate from the type of assessment work he had seen nearby. He said the northern tract had two significant problems. The eastern approach was wet and steep, expensive terrain that would require substantial grading and drainage work. The western approach was landlocked without access through private property. The only clean, flat, water-accessible approach to the northern tract was through the back of the Harrow Mill Road property, through Gerald's land, through Marian's land. Earl said it plainly, without drama, the way he had said everything else as a practical matter of geography rather than revelation. But the practical matter of geography it described was significant enough that Marian felt the ground beneath her feet differently when he said it, as though it had acquired a weight it hadn't carried a moment before. She asked him to walk the old road line. He did. He placed orange flags as he went, each one marking a point where the buried roadbed was still detectable, the slightly different density of the soil, overpacked gravel, the angles of old fence posts that made sense only if they had once run parallel to a traveled route, rather than a property boundary. The flags appeared at intervals as they moved across the field toward the tree line, and as they accumulated, they described a line that was clear and deliberate and old. A road that had been here before the brush grew over it, before anyone decided it was easier to pretend it wasn't. At the edge of the woods, Earl paused. He was looking at a black walnut tree, large and old, that stood at the boundary of what his map described as the Harrow Mill Road parcel. He reached out and touched the bark. Tied around the trunk at chest height was a length of bright blue marking tape. Clean, bright. The color was not faded. It had not been there for a season or a winter. It had been placed within weeks, perhaps less. Earl looked at Marian. Marian looked at the tape. She thought of Conrad standing at the back fence that 9th day, 20 minutes, the tree line in front of him. Earl said that blue tape was used by timber crews to mark trees selected for cutting. He said it was also used by survey teams to mark boundary reference points. He said he could not tell her which it was from looking at it alone, but he could tell her that it was not a marking she or Gerald had placed, and that it had no business being on a tree on her property without her knowledge or authorization. He photographed it with his phone. He told her not to remove it. She wasn't going to. She stood beside that tree and looked into the woods beyond, and understood that she was standing at the edge of something that had been moving long before she arrived. Something Conrad had set in motion while Gerald was still breathing, and that had not stopped simply because Gerald had died and a deed had changed hands. The question was how far it had gone. She needed to know how far it had gone. The Franklin County Register of Deeds occupied a room on the first floor of the county building next to an office that processed vehicle titles, and across from a water fountain that made a noise when it ran. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 50, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the expression of someone who processed a great deal of information every day, and had strong opinions about the quality of the information she was given. Her nameplate said Patsy Greer. Marion said she needed to review the records for a parcel on Harrow Mill Road. She gave the address and Gerald's name. Patsy typed without looking at the keyboard and pulled up the file with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and found no particular reason to make it impressive. She scrolled. She said the parcel record was straightforward original survey from 1944 purchased by Gerald Oakes in 1987, no subdivisions, no easements. Sold. One recorded water feature designation under the Harrow branch notation and a right-of-way attachment dating from 1976 that applied to the historical road access running through the property. Marion asked about the right-of-way. Patsy clicked through to a secondary record and turned the monitor slightly so Marion could see the edge of it. The right-of-way had been recorded in 1976 as a condition of a county road project that had eventually been abandoned. Because the project was never completed, the right-of-way had remained on the record without being formally vacated. It was still legally attached to the parcel. Marion asked if there were any other documents filed against the parcel in recent years. Patsy scrolled further. She stopped. She said there had been someone else asking about this parcel. Marion kept her face still. Patsy said it had been about 3 weeks ago. A man. She remembered because he had not identified himself as a lawyer or a surveyor, which were the two categories of people who usually came in asking detailed questions about specific parcels. He had been polite. He had asked specifically about the right-of-way attachment and about any pre-existing agreements or encumbrances filed against the Oaks parcel. He had driven, she had noticed through the window, a dark green pickup truck. Marion asked if Patsy could describe him. Patsy said he was probably in his late 60s, broad, well-dressed for a county records office. She said he had a nice watch. Marion wrote this in her notebook without commenting on it. She asked Patsy to continue with the file. Patsy scrolled to the last document in the record and went quiet, in the particular way of someone who has encountered something unexpected. She looked at the screen. She looked at Marion. She said there was a pre-agreement filed against the parcel 14 months ago. Not a deed, not a transfer, not an easement, but a preliminary development agreement recorded under the names of the Oakes family estate, represented by Conrad William Hale and Pinnacle Group, LLC, a Nashville-based development corporation. The agreement, Patsy said carefully, described a right of access through the Harrow Mill Road property in exchange for a development partnership arrangement. It had been executed and recorded by Conrad Hale as a representative of the Oakes family interest. Marion said nothing for a moment. She thought of the notarized revocation in her purse, signed 16 months ago, 2 months before Conrad had signed this agreement. She thought of Gerald writing in his note. He brought papers and told me I had already agreed. I had not. She asked if there was a dollar figure associated with the agreement. Patsy looked at the document. She said the filing referenced an initial consideration payment of $340,000. The number sat between them like something that had been dropped on the counter from a great height. Marion asked if she could get a copy of the full document. Patsy printed it without asking any further questions. She handed it across the counter with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had made a silent decision about which side of a situation she wanted to be on. Marion thanked her. At the door, she paused. She asked Patsy without turning fully around whether there were any other inquiries in the file, any other names, any other documents she should be aware of. Patsy said that was everything in the current record, but she said it in a way that suggested she might be thinking about something she had not technically been asked. Marian turned and looked at her. Patsy said quietly that the pre-agreement had a performance clause. If the access right was not formally transferred within 60 days of the primary estate, settling the agreement would be considered in default, and Pinnacle Group could pursue remedies. She said she was not a lawyer and could not advise on what remedies meant in practice. But she said that 60 days from the date Gerald Oakes' estate had officially opened put the deadline at approximately 6 weeks from today. 6 weeks. Marian walked out into the October air and stood on the sidewalk. $340,000. Already paid to Conrad. A deadline 6 weeks away. And in her purse a notarized document proving Conrad had no authority to make that agreement in the first place. Conrad had spent the money before the problem was solved. That was why he had looked so still in the conference room when Mr. Denton read the revocation, not because he was surprised, because he already knew he was in trouble and he had been calculating in real time whether he could still find a way out of it. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air slowly. Then she took out her phone and called Mr. Denton's office. She did not leave a message. She asked to speak with him directly and said it was important. His assistant put her through within 2 minutes. She described what she had found in the county records. She read him the dollar figure. She described the timeline. Mr. Denton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said Conrad didn't just want the land, Marian. He needed it, because he had already spent the money. She drove back to Harrow Mill Road in the late afternoon. The light was going amber by the time she pulled in the drive, long and low, through the trees, catching the tin roof of the shed and the rust orange of the autumn canopy at the property's edge. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house, thinking about what came next. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. A young man's voice. Careful. Uncertain in the way of someone who had made up his mind to do something and was now in the middle of doing it, and could feel the weight of it differently than he had when he was only thinking about it. He said, "It's Lawson. Lawson Hale." She waited. He said he needed to tell her something and that he needed her to understand. He wasn't doing it because he was on her side, or because he thought the family had been wrong, because he wasn't ready to say those things. He said he was doing it because he had overheard something he couldn't unhear, and he did not want to be standing next to his father when the structure of whatever his father had built came apart, which he now believed was going to happen regardless of what anyone did. She said she was listening. He said that 2 days ago he had been in his father's home office returning a set of car keys he'd borrowed, and his father had been on a call. He had not heard Lawson come in. He was speaking to someone at Pinnacle Group. He was assuring them that the access issue would be resolved, that the estate situation was a complication, but not a barrier, that he had confidence. The primary obstacle would be removed before the 60-day window closed. The primary obstacle. Lawson said his father had used that phrase twice. He said the way his father had said it, and the context made it clear that the primary obstacle was not a legal document. It was Marian. She absorbed this without moving. She asked Lawson if his father knew he had heard the call. Lawson said no. He had set the keys down and left without his father seeing him. She asked why he was telling her this rather than saying nothing and staying clear of it. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I've been watching my father treat people like variables in a calculation my whole life, and I thought it was just how business worked, and I'm 38 years old and I'm starting to think it isn't. She did not tell him he was brave for calling. She did not thank him for his conscience. Those things could be true and also beside the point. Instead, she asked him if he could remember the name of the person his father had been speaking with at Pinnacle Group. He said he thought it was Greer, Marcus Greer. She wrote the name down, though she already had it. Then she said she needed to go and that she appreciated him calling and that she hoped he understood the situation was going to resolve itself one way or another, and that the thing about being on the right side was that it tended to be clearer in retrospect than it felt in the moment. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She ended the call. She sat in the car in the fading amber light and looked at the shed. The shed key was in her coat pocket. It had been there all day. She had been carrying it since the morning through the boreholes in the spring and the register of deeds and the phone call with Mr. Denton. And now Lawson's careful, frightened voice. She got out of the car. She walked past the house across the yard through the dead grass. The temperature had dropped in the last hour, and her breath made small shapes in the air in front of her. She reached the shed and looked at the padlock. Earl had documented the fresh scratches on it that morning, the bright lines cut through old metal, where someone had tried to force it not years ago recently. Conrad, the 9th day, 20 minutes, the tree line and the fence, and apparently the shed door. She put the key in the lock. It turned hard the way a lock turned when it had not been opened in a long time. Then something gave and the padlock released with a dry sound, and she lifted it away from the hasp and opened the door. The interior of the shed smelled of oil and old wood and cold. The last of the daylight coming through the door was enough to see by if she didn't need to see detail. She looked around old tools on wall hooks, a rusted cultivator, clay pots stacked in one corner, 2 tires leaning against the far wall. Nothing that would have interested Conrad. But against the back wall, half under a canvas tarp that had been pulled off and replaced in a hurry, she could see where the edge didn't lie. Flat anymore was a green metal cabinet. Industrial, squat and wide. The kind of thing sold at farm auctions, built to last longer than the people who bought it. Its lock, too, showed fresh scratches. She searched the shelves. Nothing. The canvas tarp, the pots, an old coffee can. Then she remembered the way Gerald thought, and she crouched carefully and ran her hand along the underside of the lowest shelf. The strip of tape was there. She felt it before she saw it. She pulled it free and held it up in the light from the doorway. A small brass key, taped flat to the underside of a shelf in a shed on a piece of land everyone had spent decades telling each other was worthless. She stood. She unlocked the cabinet. Inside were folders, perhaps a dozen each, labeled in Gerald's handwriting. Road, water, timber, taxes, survey notes, correspondence. And at the back of the cabinet, standing upright between 2 of the folders, a cellular phone. Old. A model from 5 or 6 years ago. Its screen was dark, but when she pressed the side button, it powered on, showing a battery at 32% and 1 video file in the storage. 4 months before Gerald died. That was the date on the file. Her hands were entirely steady when she pressed play. Gerald's face appeared. He was sitting in what she recognized as the kitchen of this house, the window behind him, the chipped edge of the counter, the pale winter light that said he had made this during the cold months. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who had been ill long enough to stop being surprised by it. But his eyes were clear. He looked directly at the camera with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything he had ever considered important. He said her name. He said he had hoped she would be the one to find this because he had arranged things so that only she would know to look. He said he owed her an explanation he had never known how to give in person, so he was doing it this way instead, which was probably cowardly, but was the best he had to offer at this point. He said Conrad had come to him in the spring of the previous year with a proposal from a company called Pinnacle Group. The land behind Harrow Mill Road was being developed. The only viable access route ran through his property. Conrad said it was simple, let them through, take a share, everyone was better off. Gerald had said he needed to think about it. Conrad came back twice more. Each time the offer was slightly different. Each time Gerald had said he needed more time. The third time, Conrad had brought a representative from Pinnacle Group and a set of documents and told Gerald he had already verbally agreed to the terms and they just needed his signature to formalize it. Gerald paused on the screen. He looked directly into the camera. He said, "I had not agreed to anything. I want that said out loud and on record because Conrad will say otherwise." He said he had called his attorney the next morning and begun the process of protecting himself and his property from what he now understood was not a business proposal but a plan that had been running without his knowledge for some time. He said he was leaving everything to Marian because she was the only person who had ever come to him without wanting something from the land. Every meal, every appointment, every winter afternoon she had come because he needed the company, and she gave it without making him feel that it cost her anything. He said he was not good at saying that kind of thing directly, which was why he was putting it on a video after he was no longer in a position to be embarrassed by it. He said, "Don't let them rush you. You'll know what to do when you see what's in this cabinet." Then he reached forward and stopped the recording. Marian stood in the dim shed with the phone in both hands, and the amber light going gray behind her through the open door. She did not cry. She had done that privately months ago at a time and in a way that was her own. What she felt now was something different from grief, something cleaner and more directional, a clarifying. She placed the phone in her coat pocket. She gathered the folders from the cabinet and tucked them under her arm. She pulled the door of the shed closed and replaced the padlock. Then she walked back through the dead grass to the house, went inside, locked the kitchen door behind her, and sat at the table. She called Mr. Denton and told him about the video. His silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that she checked to make sure the call had not dropped. Then he said, "Send me the file tonight. Do not show it to anyone else before we speak tomorrow morning." She said she would. She said one more thing before she hung up. She said, "I'm calling Marcus Greer tomorrow." Mr. Denton said, "I think that is exactly the right move." She said good night and set the phone on the table. Outside, the wind had picked up again. The same low traveling sound she had heard the first evening moving through the trees at the edge of the property across the spring. She had sat beside in the early morning light through the walnut trees with their blue tape over the ground where men had drilled their silent holes, while Gerald was too far away to stop them. The land had been waiting a long time for someone to pay attention to it properly. Marian spread Gerald's folders across the table and began to read. She was up before 5 again, not from anxiety this time, from intention. She made coffee in Gerald's kitchen using the old percolator she had found in the back cabinet, the kind nobody manufactured anymore, the kind that required patience and rewarded it. She sat at the table with the folders spread in front of her and her notebook open and the video file queued on Gerald's old phone, and she worked through everything methodically, the way she had always worked through difficult things, not quickly. Not with the urgency that other people seemed to think was the same as competence, but carefully, with the understanding that a mistake made fast was still a mistake. By 7, she had a clear picture. Conrad had signed a pre-agreement with Pinnacle Group 14 months ago, 2 months after Gerald had legally revoked his authority to do so. Pinnacle had paid $340,000 into an arrangement that was at its foundation fraudulent. The 60-day performance window was closing. Conrad had spent the money. The video on Gerald's phone established in Gerald's own voice and on Gerald's own record that he had never agreed to any of it. She had the revocation, she had the video, she had the county record, she had the bore holes in her field and the blue tape on her tree and the scratches on her locks. What she did not yet have was control of what happened next. That was the thing she intended to change this morning. She called Marcus Greer at 7:45. She had found the number on the Pinnacle Group website the night before a direct line listed under development partnerships. She did not know if he would answer a number he didn't recognize at that hour. He answered on the second ring. She said her name. She said she was the legal owner of 417 Harrow Mill Road in Franklin County, Tennessee, and that she understood Pinnacle Group had a significant interest in a property that required access through her land. A brief silence. Not a long one. The silence of a man recalibrating quickly. He said yes, that was correct, and that he had been hoping to speak with her. She said she imagined he had. She said she also imagined he had been given certain assurances about how that conversation would come about and by whom, and that she wanted him to know before they went any further that those assurances had not come from anyone with the legal authority to make them. Another silence, longer this time. She said she was not calling to be adversarial. She was calling because she believed he was a professional who had been placed in a difficult position by someone else's decisions, and that she thought he deserved to know the actual state of things before he sent anyone else to her property or took any further action on the basis of a document that was legally void. She said she would be sending him through her attorney, Mr. Denton, a copy of the notarized revocation Gerald had executed 16 months ago, and a copy of the county record showing when Conrad had signed the pre-agreement, and one additional piece of documentation she would describe as definitive and leave it at that. Marcus Greer said quietly, and with the careful precision of a man choosing his words the way you chose your footing on uncertain ground. Mrs. Oakes, I think I need to speak with our legal team before we continue this conversation. She said she thought that was wise. She said she would be available for a follow-up call that afternoon through Mr. Denton's office, and that she hoped they could resolve this in a way that didn't require either of them to spend the next year in a courtroom. He said he would be in touch. She ended the call. She wrote the time in her notebook. Then she called Mr. Denton and told him what she had done, and he was quiet for a moment in the particular way she was beginning to recognize as his version of being surprised, and then he said he would have everything to Pinnacle's legal team within the hour. She told him one more thing. She told him she expected Conrad to come to the property today and that she wanted Earl Sutton and Velma Brant there when he did, and that she needed Mr. Denton to be available to come in person if the situation required it. He said he would clear his afternoon. She thanked him and ended the call and sat for a moment with her hands around the warm coffee mug. Then she called Earl. Then she walked across the yard and knocked on the property line fence and called over to Velma. She had 2 hours before anything would arrive. She used them to walk the property one more time alone in the clear morning light. The bore holes, the spring, the old road line with Earl's orange flag still marking it, the walnut tree with the blue tape, the shed with its scratched locks. She walked all of it slowly and without the distraction of anyone else's opinions, just herself and the land and the light moving across it. And by the time she came back to the house, she knew every piece of it, the way she had never known it before, not as a burden or an inheritance or a legal instrument, but as a place specific and particular in hers. Marcus Greer called back at 10:47. He did not open with pleasantries. He said that Pinnacle Group's legal team had reviewed the documents Mr. Denton had sent, and that they had significant concerns about the basis of the pre-agreement. He said the revocation document, if authentic and properly recorded, which their team was in the process of confirming with the county, would render the pre-agreement legally unenforceable. He said that Pinnacle Group had acted in good faith on the basis of representations made by Conrad Hale, and that if those representations had been fraudulent, Pinnacle Group's position was very different from what they had been led to believe. He said the word fraudulent carefully, the way lawyers said words they meant but were still deciding whether to commit to in writing. She asked him directly whether Pinnacle Group still had an interest in the access route through her property. He said yes. That interest had not changed. The northern tract remained their primary development target, and the southern access remained the most viable route. She said then she was willing to have that conversation, on her terms with her attorney present in writing, with full protections for the spring and the timber and the historical road structure. She said she was not opposed to a fair arrangement. She was opposed to being treated as an obstacle in someone else's plan. He said he understood. She said she would like him to come to the property tomorrow with his team, and that she would have her attorney and her surveyor present, and that they would walk the land together and discuss what a legitimate arrangement might look like. He said he would be there. She ended the call and looked out the kitchen window at the backfield. The orange flags Earl had placed were still there, bright against the dead grass, marking the line of the buried road, like a sentence finally being written out clearly after years of existing only as intention. Conrad arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She had expected him earlier. The fact that he came at 2 suggested he had spent the morning trying to reach Marcus Greer, and had not gotten through, or had gotten through and had not liked what he heard. Either way, he came alone. No Sylvia, no Lawson, just Conrad in his dark jacket and his truck, which he parked without his usual assurance, slightly crooked in the drive. The front wheel angled against the gravel in the way of someone who had parked fast and wasn't thinking about the parking. Marian was on the porch when he came up the drive. She had seen him through the kitchen window and had come outside deliberately. She wanted this conversation in the open air, in the daylight, with the land visible behind her, not in a room where furniture and walls could create the false intimacy of a private negotiation. Earl Sutton was at the back of the property doing additional measurements near the spring. Velma was on her own porch across the fence line, visible from where Marian stood, ostensibly pulling dead growth from a window box, but positioned with the clear sightlines of someone who had made a decision about where she intended to be. Conrad stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at Marian. He looked past her at the house. He looked toward the back field where Earl's orange flags were visible even from this distance. He said he had been trying to reach Marcus Greer. She said she knew. He looked at her for a moment. Then some quality shifted in his face, not dramatically, not the way faces shifted in films, but in the small, subtle way of a man who had decided to stop maintaining one version of a conversation and move to another. He said he thought they should talk. Inside. Privately. She said she was comfortable where she was. He came up 2 steps, which put him on the porch, but below where she stood, and said that she needed to understand the position she was putting herself in. He said Pinnacle Group was not a small operation. He said the 60-day window was a real deadline with real consequences, and that whatever she thought she had found in Gerald's papers, the practical reality of the situation was that the access deal was already in motion, and stopping it now would create problems for everyone. She looked at him steadily. He was 68 years old and broad and accustomed to being the largest presence in any room, and he was standing on her porch telling her that reality was whatever he said it was, and she felt looking at him a kind of clarity that had nothing to do with anger. She said, "Conrad, I spoke with Marcus Greer this morning." He stopped. She said, "He has the revocation document, he has the county records, he has Gerald's video." Conrad's face changed. It was the first time she had seen his face change in a way he had not intended, and it was not dramatic. Just a slight loosening around the eyes, a fractional shift in the set of his jaw. The expression of a man who has spent a great deal of energy maintaining a position and has just understood that the position no longer exists. He said, "What video?" She said Gerald had recorded himself 4 months before he died, describing every conversation Conrad had brought to him about Pinnacle Group, including the meeting where Conrad had brought documents and told Gerald he had already agreed to terms he had never agreed to. Conrad said nothing. The wind moved across the field. One of Earl's orange flags stirred at the far edge of the property. She said he said it out loud, on camera, in his own words, in the kitchen of this house, so that you couldn't rewrite it. Conrad sat down on the porch step. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was simply what happened when a large, certain man runs out of ground to stand on and needs a moment to reckon with the altered landscape. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the boards of the porch between his feet. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then he said in a voice that had lost its management of itself, "I wasn't trying to steal from him." She waited. He said, "The deal was good. It was a good deal for everyone. I just knew he'd say no if I asked him straight. He always said no to everything. He always made everything harder than it had to be." She said, "So you told him he had already agreed?" He didn't answer. She said, "I was sick, Conrad. He was sick and he was alone, and you brought paperwork to this house and told him his memory was failing him." Conrad looked up at her, and she saw something she had not expected. Not defiance, not calculation, but a kind of exhausted guilt that had probably been living in him for longer than he was willing to admit, and that had not made him stop because in her experience, guilt without consequence rarely did. She said, "I am not going to make this easier for you, but I'm not going to make it worse than it is either. Pinnacle Group will deal with me directly. Whatever arrangements get made will be legal and documented and fair, and whatever happens between you and them regarding the money is between you and them. That is not my problem to solve," he said, Marion. She said, "I think you should leave now." He stood. He was still a large man. He still had the kind of physical presence that took up space. But something had gone out of it, and she stood on her own porch in the October light and watched him come down the steps and cross the yard and get into his truck, and she felt not triumph but the quiet particular satisfaction of a thing having been said that should have been said calmly and without cruelty, and landing exactly where it needed to. His truck backed down the drive. It moved away down Harrow Mill Road and disappeared around the bend. Velma, from across the fence line, looked over at Marion and gave a single slow nod. Earl appeared from the back field, walking toward the house with his clipboard. Marion went inside and made a fresh pot of coffee. Lawson came that evening, unannounced, which she suspected was the only way he could have made himself come at all, without time to think it through too carefully and find a reason not to. He knocked at the front door. He had driven his own car, not his father's truck. He was wearing clothes that suggested he had come directly from somewhere else, or had been meaning to come for hours and finally made himself do it. He looked younger than 38 at that moment, standing on the porch in the fading light. Not young in the way of inexperience, but young in the way of someone confronting something for the first time that other people figured out earlier. She opened the door and looked at him. He said, "I heard he came today." She said, "Yes." He said, "Are you all right?" The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was genuine, and she had not been expecting genuine from a Hale in quite this form. She said she was fine. She said he should come in. They sat at the kitchen table. She poured coffee. Lawson held the mug with both hands, the way people held warm things when they needed something to hold. And he looked at the table, and she could see him deciding how to begin and deciding against several attempts before he finally said, "I've been thinking about what my father did. Not the legal part, the other part." She waited. He said, "He went to a dying man with papers and told him he was confused. And I didn't think he was capable of something like that. I knew he was hard. I knew he pushed things, but that he stopped." She said, "It's a difficult thing to know about a parent." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "It doesn't require you to stop loving him. It just requires you to see him clearly." He looked up at her. She said Gerald saw Conrad clearly for a long time. He didn't stop caring about family. He just stopped pretending the clarity wasn't there. Lawson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, He left everything to you, not to us, not to his blood.
To you. She said yes. He said, why do you think he did that? She considered the question honestly. She said, because I came. That's all. I came when no one asked me to, and I came again, and I didn't keep a record of it or expect anything for it. And Gerald was a man who noticed what people did more than what they said. Lawson looked at the table. He said, we didn't come. She said, no. He said, I didn't come either. He said, She didn't tell him it was fine because it wasn't fine, and he knew it wasn't fine, and she had spent too many decades offering comfort that softened truths people needed to carry. Instead, she said, you came tonight. He looked at her. She said, that's not nothing. They sat for a while without talking. The house settled around them. The old refrigerator cycled on. Outside, the wind moved through the trees at the edge of the property, that same low-traveling sound she had been listening to every evening since she arrived, and she had started to feel it as something familiar rather than something strange. The land making its ordinary sounds alive and continuous and unbothered by everything that had been happening on its surface. When Lawson left, he shook her hand at the door. Not a hug. She didn't think either of them was ready for that, and she respected that. He seemed to understand it. Just a handshake, firm and brief, and then he went to his car and drove away, and she watched his tail lights until they were gone. Sylvia came the following morning alone. No Conrad, no Lawson, no silver SUV. She had driven a smaller car, something older, which Marian noted without comment. She was dressed as always with care, but something about the care was different today, less constructed, less intentional. The coat was her good coat, but the buttons were done up slightly off one hole, misaligned at the bottom, and she had not caught it, or had caught it and not cared, which were both unusual. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Marian. She said, I thought about calling first. Marian said, I'm glad you didn't. Come up. They sat in the 2 chairs on the porch. Marian had brought out coffee without being asked, and Sylvia held hers without drinking it immediately, turning the mug in her hands. The morning was clear and cold. The field at the back of the property was visible from where they sat. Earl's orange flags still bright against the dead grass, the tree line dark beyond. Sylvia said, I knew something was wrong. She said it the way people said things that had been waiting a long time to be said. Not as a confession rehearsed in advance, but as a fact that had finally found the opening it needed. She said, I didn't know the details. Conrad doesn't explain himself to me, but I knew he was doing something that involved this property, and I knew Gerald had not agreed to it because Gerald wouldn't agree to anything Conrad wanted without a fight, and there was no fight, which meant Conrad had found a way around the fight. And I told myself it was business, that it wasn't my place to ask. Marian looked at the field. Sylvia said, I told myself a lot of things. She set the coffee mug down on the arm of the chair and looked at her hands. She said, I was not kind to you, Marian, for a very long time. Not cruel exactly, but not kind. I made you feel like you were tolerated. And that was deliberate, even when I told myself it wasn't. The wind moved across the field. Marian said, why are you telling me this now? Sylvia said, because Conrad is going to face consequences. I can't prevent and can't fix, and somewhere in the middle of watching that happen, I realized that the person who actually deserved to be apologized to was you, and that I had been putting that off my entire adult life, and I was 65 years old, and I did not want to put it off any further. Marian looked at her. This was not the Sylvia who had sat across a conference table with a cream coat and a practiced smile. This was a woman in a coat with a misaligned button, who had driven herself to a house she had spent years dismissing to say something she would have found a reason not to say if she'd given herself one more day to think about it. Marian said, you're right. You weren't kind. Sylvia absorbed this without deflecting. Marian said, and I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter because it did. But I'm also not going to hold it against you for the rest of whatever time we have. That's a choice I'm making for myself, not for you. Sylvia looked at her with the expression of someone receiving something they had not allowed themselves to hope for. Marian said, Gerald thought family was something you built through what you did not, something you inherited automatically. I think he was right. I'm willing to find out if we can build something different, but it starts with honesty, not with pretending the past was different than it was. Sylvia said, I understand. They sat together on the porch for another 20 minutes, not talking much, watching the field, watching the flags, watching the tree line where the land changed and the old road disappeared into the trees that Gerald had spent years making sure no one cut without a reason he approved of. When Sylvia left, she touched Marian's arm once at the porch steps, a small gesture, brief and careful, like someone trying a word in a language they were only beginning to learn. Marian watched her drive away. Then she turned and looked at the house behind her, the patched roof, the repaired porch. Earl's nephew had come out last week and replaced the support beam, and the corner no longer dipped. The front door, which she had not yet painted. She thought tomorrow. The meeting with Pinnacle Group happened on a Tuesday, 3 days after Marcus Greer's call. He came with 2 others from his team, a woman who handled environmental compliance and a man who was their infrastructure attorney. Mr. Denton was already at the kitchen table when they arrived. Earl Sutton was at the back of the property with his clipboard available if needed. Velma was on her porch, which Marian had begun to understand was simply Velma's preferred position whenever anything significant was happening in the vicinity. Marian offered coffee. They accepted. She poured it herself without apology for the age of the percolator or the plainness of the mugs. Then she sat at the head of the table. Marcus Greer looked different from how she had imagined him when she had dialed his number that morning in the county parking lot. He was somewhere in his early 50s, careful looking, with the particular manner of someone who had built a career on reading situations accurately, and was now reading this one with more attention than he had given the previous version of it. He set a folder on the table and looked at her and said, Mrs. Oakes, I want to begin by saying that Pinnacle Group deeply regrets the manner in which this property was brought into our development process. She said, I appreciate that. He said what was represented to us as a family agreement was not that. She said, no, it was not. He said, we have suspended our arrangement with Mr. Hale pending legal review, and we understand that any discussion of access to this property must go through you and your attorney, and only you and your attorney. She said, that's correct. He said, with that understanding established, I'd like to talk about what's possible, if you're willing. She said she was willing. What followed was 3 hours of the kind of conversation that was uncomfortable in the way of all conversations in which real things were being decided. Not dramatic, not hostile, but dense with significance, full of pauses, while people consulted documents full of moments, when one side stated a position and the other side sat with it before responding. Mr. Denton spoke often. Marian spoke when something required her specific knowledge of the land, or her specific position on a condition she was not willing to negotiate. She was not willing to negotiate on the spring. It would be fenced and protected in perpetuity with a monitoring requirement written into any access agreement. She was not willing to negotiate on the timber. No trees within 40 feet of the spring branch. Any cutting elsewhere on the property required approval from a licensed forester she selected. She was not willing to negotiate on the historical road structure. The old roadbed would be restored, not destroyed in the process of any development access. It would remain passable after any construction was complete. She was willing to negotiate on access timing, on maintenance responsibilities, on the compensation structure, on the specific boundaries of any easement granted. By the time the Pinnacle team left, they had the outline of a framework.
Not a signed agreement that would take weeks more and lawyers and formal surveys and several more conversations, but a framework, a real one built on real terms negotiated by the person whose name was on the deed. Marcus Greer shook her hand at the door. He held it a moment and said Gerald Oakes was a difficult man to work with. She said yes, he was.
He said, I was also apparently an excellent judge of people. She didn't answer that, but she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. Winter came in quietly that year. The first frost arrived on a Thursday morning, whitening the field and the fence posts and the dead grass along the spring branch. Marian saw it through the kitchen window while the coffee percolated, and she stood looking at it for a while before she did anything else. The way the frost made the land look newly drawn, every edge precise, every surface clarified. Conrad faced a civil suit from Pinnacle Group. The matter of criminal charges was, as Mr. Denton put it, pending review by the district attorney's office. Marian had provided her documentation and Gerald's video. What happened next was in other hands, which was where it belonged. Lawson visited twice more before Christmas. Each time they sat at the kitchen table for an hour or so, sometimes talking, sometimes not. He helped her carry the old feed bags out of the shed on the second visit, which was practical, and also she suspected his way of finding something useful to do with his hands while he figured out how to be different from what he had been raised to be. She thought he would probably manage it. Not perfectly, and not all at once, but gradually and genuinely, in the way that real changes happened when they happened at all. The timber sale she arranged with the forester. She had selected a careful, methodical woman named Greta, who spent more time looking at trees she was keeping than at the ones she was marking, covered the cost of what the house needed. A new furnace. A proper roof, not patched, but replaced. New lock sets on both exterior doors in the shed. The porch rebuilt from the second board-up level, now solid underfoot. She did not change the kitchen. Not the mug. Not the linoleum. Not the window that looked out at the back field. Some things were worth leaving exactly where they were. The access agreement with Pinnacle Group was signed in the early spring on a morning with the particular light quality of a Tennessee April, pale and new, everything just beginning to green. Mr. Denton witnessed it. Earl Sutton certified the survey boundary markings. Velma brought cornbread. The compensation was fair, more than fair. Enough to make the property entirely self-sustaining, to establish the Spring Protection Fund, to pay the legal fees, and still leave what she thought of as a margin for the unexpected, because, as in her experience, the unexpected always arrived eventually, and the only variable was whether you had something left to meet it with. On the morning she painted the front door, there was no particular occasion for it. She had simply bought the paint, a deep, particular blue, the color of the sky at that moment in the afternoon, when it was too late to be daytime and too early to be evening. A blue that was serious without being heavy, and she had waited for a warm enough day, and the warm day had arrived, and she painted the door. She worked slowly, one careful stroke at a time, the way she did everything that mattered to her. The paint filled the old cracks in the wood and settled into the grain in the door, which had been the washed-out color of something that had given up on having a color, became something deliberate and present, something that said, "Here, someone is here." Velma stood at the gate watching. She called over, "Looks like it knows who owns it now." Marian looked at the door, then at the field behind the house, then at the trees at the edge of the property, which were beginning to show the first green of new leaves. The spring was running clean below the pasture, the water moving over the pale stone the way it had moved for longer than anyone on this land had been alive. She said, "Maybe it does." That evening she sat on the porch with the last of the afternoon coffee warming her hands. The boards beneath her chair held firm. The field was still. The road line was no longer hidden.
Earl had cleared it properly as part of the
pinnacle agreement. The old gravel regraded and visible again, no longer pretending to be nothing. She took Gerald's phone from her coat pocket. She found the video file. She pressed play. His face appeared. The kitchen behind him. The winter light. He looked tired and clear-eyed, and directly at the camera he said her name. She listened to all of it again, the way she had listened to it a dozen times since that first evening in the shed. Not looking for new information, she had absorbed all the information. She listened because of the way his voice sounded when he spoke, without trying to manage the effect of what he was saying. Plain, deliberate. Like the man she had known across 30 years of ordinary moments she had not known he was keeping. When it was finished, she closed the app and set the phone on the arm of the chair. The last light was going across the field, that amber that moved like something living from tree line to fence post to the face of the house, and then slowly, without drama, released its hold on the day and let the blue come in. She thought about what he had said at the beginning. The first time she had heard it on the porch of this house 3 years ago, she had thought it was the medication, or the exhaustion of a man who knew he was running out of time. She understood it now. Not as a mystery solved, but as a simple truth that had needed the right conditions to be seen clearly. Like the old road under the grass, like the spring under the stone, like everything Gerald had trusted her to find in the right order without being rushed when she was ready to understand it. She sat on the porch of the house that no one had wanted and looked out across the land that everyone had underestimated, and for the first time in as many years as she could remember, she was not waiting to be welcomed anywhere. She was already home, and the land which remembered everything knew her name.